Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the fundamentals political science. You've asked for it, and we're here to deliver a focused look at Maurice Duverger's Introduction to Political Science. Our aim, to pull out the key ideas, the core concepts from this, well, essential text, really, to give you a solid grasp of how political systems tick.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. Divergers gives you this um, systematic way of looking at what politics is actually about. So it's perfect if you want to get up to speed, quickly but properly.
Exactly. We're going to follow his structure pretty closely, look at his definition of political science, then the state, political regimes, parties, and finally international relations. Think of it as your streamlined guide. Okay, let's dive in. How does Duverger actually define political science? Where does he start?
They're right. So for Diverger, at its core, political science is the study of power, specifically the power that's exercised within a society. It's all about looking at how power is gained, who has it, and what effects its use has.
Okay, so power. And how does that make it different from, say, sociology or economics? They look at society too.
That's a good point. While others study different facets of society, political science really zooms in on government and, crucially, those relationships based on authority and obedience.
Ah, obedience. So not just who's in charge, but why people generally go along with it.
Precisely. And that ties into this idea of the political. It can be a bit slippery to define, as Duverger notes, but generally it revolves around how communities handle conflict, how disagreements are managed, and how authority functions within that group, making decisions for the community.
Any group decision, really. Resource allocation rules.
Exactly. That's likely political in his sense.
And Duverger doesn't just say there's one way to study this, does he? He talks about different approaches.
Yes, he outlines a few key ways. You can look at the institutions, the formal structures like parliaments, courts, bureaucracies, or you can focus on political behavior, how people actually act in the political sphere. Voting, protesting, lobbying, that sort of thing. And then there's political thought. The ideas, the philosophies behind it all. Libertarianism, socialism, conservatism.
Different lenses for the same subject.
Right. And they often work best together, giving you a fuller picture.
And it's not static, is it? Political science has to adapt.
Absolutely. Diverger stresses that. As societies change, the way we study politics, the questions we ask, they have to evolve too.
Okay, this is really interesting. Let's get into maybe the most central concept, the state. How does Duverger understand the state?
Well, he gives us a really influential definition. He says the state is a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory.
Whoa, okay. Let's unpack that. Monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force. That sounds stark.
It is. It means basically that the state is seen as the only entity that has the accepted right to use force police, military. If, a private group tries to do that, it's usually seen as illegal, criminal.
And the word legitimate is doing a lot of work there, isn't it?
Huge amount. It's not just about having the biggest guns, it's about having the right to use them, a right that's generally accepted by the population. This legitimacy, it often comes from consent, even if it's tacit consent, not always active voting.
Okay. And what are the building blocks of this state, according to him?
He identifies three key elements: a defined territory borders, a population living there, and political power, which we usually call sovereignty.
Sovereignty, another big one. And he breaks that down further, right? Internal and external.
Yes, exactly. Internal sovereignty is about being the ultimate authority within your own borders. The state's law is supreme. External sovereignty is about independence from other states. No outside power should be dictating your internal policies, in theory.
Right, so you can't really be sovereign if another country is pulling the strings.
Pretty much, yeah. That compromises external sovereignty.
States aren't all structured the same way. Duverger talks about different forms.
He does. He mentions unitary, federal, and confederal forms.
Yeah.
A unitary state, like the UK or France, concentrates most power at the national level. Regions might have powers, but they're typically granted by the center.
Okay.
A federal state, think the US or Germany, divides power constitutionally between the national government and regional units, states, provinces, lender. Each level has its own protected sphere of authority.
Right, division of powers.
And then a confederal state is looser still. It's more like an alliance of independent states that give very limited powers to a central body, but keep most of their autonomy. Historically, maybe the early U.S. under the Articles of Confederation, or parts of Swiss history.
So a spectrum from very centralized to quite decentralized. What about what states do? Their functions.
Well, the traditional core functions are things like maintaining order,
Hmm.
police and courts, defending the borders, making and enforcing laws, basic stuff. But Diverger points out, and it's obviously true, that states, especially modern ones, do way more now.
Like what?
Social welfare is huge. Healthcare, pensions, education, managing the economy, building infrastructure, sometimes even cultural promotion. The role keeps expanding.
Yeah, the modern state is involved in a lot. Okay, that gives us a really solid picture of the state. Now, let's shift gears slightly to political regimes. How does Diverger categorize the different ways states are actually run?
Okay, so a political regime, for him, is basically the set of rules and practices, formal and informal, that dictate how power is obtained and used in a state. It's like the political operating system. And he makes a broad initial cut. Democracies and non-democracies.
Seems fundamental. What does he see as the absolute must-haves for a democracy?
He really emphasizes a few things. Free and fair elections are crucial, real choice, no intimidation, votes counted properly. Then there's the rule of law, meaning everyone, leaders included, is subject to the law. No one's above it. And finally, protecting basic rights and freedoms, speech, assembly, press. Those are hallmarks of democracy.
Makes sense. And within democracy, he sees different models.
Yes, he talks about parliamentary and presidential systems as major types.
How do they differ, mainly?
In a parliamentary system, think UK, Canada, Germany, the executive branch, the government, emerges from and is accountable to the legislature, the parliament. The prime minister or chancellor is usually the leader of the majority party or coalition and can be kicked out by a vote of no confidence.
Yeah.
So a fusion of power, in a way.
Okay, closely linked.
Whereas in a presidential system like the US or Brazil, there's a clearer separation. The president is usually directly elected, serves as head of state and government, and isn't directly accountable to the legislature in the same way. They can't just vote him out easily.
Right, separate elections, separate mandates, different potential issues too, like gridlock in one, maybe instability in the other.
That's often the debate, yeah. Accountability versus potential instability or deadlock.
Okay, now for the other side of that coin, non-democratic regimes. What are the key types Duverger discusses?
He talks broadly about authoritarianism and totalitarianism. Authoritarian regimes typically restrict political competition and participation. Power is concentrated maybe in one leader or a small group, an oligarchy or a junta. They might allow some social or economic freedom, but political opposition is heavily controlled or suppressed.
Limited political freedom, basically, and totalitarianism.
That's more extreme. Totalitarian regimes try to control everything, not just politics, but the economy, culture, social life, even people's private thoughts, ideally. They usually have a strong, pervasive ideology, use mass mobilization, and rely heavily on repression and surveillance. Think Nazi Germany or Stalinist Soviet Union.
So a much deeper, more penetrating level of control. A huge difference.
A qualitative difference, really. It's about the scope and depth of state control.
Got it. Okay, let's move to political parties. Another crucial piece of the puzzle. How does Duverger define them?
Simply put, a political party is an organized group aiming to win political power, usually through elections. Their main job, you could say, is to connect the public's preferences with government action. They're intermediaries.
Like vehicles for political ambition and policy ideas?
Yeah.
And they do more than just run in elections, right? What are their functions?
Oh, definitely. Duverger highlights several key roles. They structure the vote, give people clear choices, they formulate policies, develop platforms and agendas, what will we do if we win, and they recruit and train political leaders. They're kind of the pipeline for future ministers, presidents, legislators.
Talent scouts and training grounds, like you said before, makes sense. And the way parties operate depends on the system, right? He talks about different party systems.
Yes, he outlines the main types. You have single-party systems, where only one party is allowed to rule. Pretty straightforward, if undemocratic. Then two-party systems, where two major parties dominate, like traditionally in the US or UK, though that can fluctuate. They alternate in power, mostly.
Okay.
And multi-party systems, common across much of Europe, where you have several viable parties competing, often leading to coalition governments because no single party wins a majority.
Right. Each system has its own dynamics, doesn't it? Stability, representation.
Exactly. Single-party systems might seem stable, but lack representation. Multi-party systems might be more representative, but sometimes prone to instability if coalitions are hard to form or maintain. Two-party systems have their own pros and cons too, potentially leading to moderation, but maybe limiting choices.
And what shapes these systems? Why does one country have two parties and another have 10?
Duverger points to a few key things. Social cleavages are important deep divisions in society. Think class, religion, ethnicity, region. Parties often form along these lines to represent specific groups.
Like labor parties versus conservative parties, or religious parties, or regional parties.
Precisely. Then the electoral system itself matters hugely. Winner-take-all systems, like in the US or UK for legislature seats, tend to push towards two parties. Proportional representation systems, where seats are allocated based on vote share, tend to allow more parties to gain representation.
Ah, the rules of the game influence the number of players.
Absolutely. And, of course, history matters. Political traditions, major historical events, they all leave their mark on the party system.
It's a complex interplay. Okay, finally, let's zoom out to the biggest picture, international relations. What's Duverger's focus here?
Well, here the focus shifts to how states interact with each other. Diplomacy, war, trade, cooperation, conflict, the whole range. It's about how these independent units, the states, manage their relationships when there's no world government telling them what to do.
Right, which leads to that concept you mentioned, anarchy, not chaos, but no higher authority.
Exactly. Anarchy in IR theory just means the absence of a global sovereign. Each state is technically on its own, formally equal. And Duverger notes the main players, primarily states, of course. But he also acknowledges the growing role of international organizations, IGOs like the UN or the WTO.
And non-governmental ones, too, NGOs.
Yes, NGOs like Doctors Without Borders or Amnesty International, they're increasingly influential actors on the world stage, even if they don't have armies.
So it's a more crowded stage than just states, and there are different theories about how this all works.
There are. He touches on some major ones. Realism is a big one. It emphasizes power, national interest, security. States are seen as rational actors trying to survive and maximize their power in a dangerous world.
Kind of a dog-eat-dog view?
Can be, yeah. Then there's liberalism, which is more optimistic about cooperation. It highlights interdependence, international institutions, democracy, trade things that can foster peace.
So cooperation is possible, even likely sometimes.
According to liberals, yes. And then there's constructivism, which focuses more on ideas, norms, identities. How do shared beliefs or historical relationships shape how states see each other and act? It's not just about material power or institutions.
Different ways of explaining why countries do what they do.
Exactly. Different analytical tools.
And even though there's anarchy, Duverger mentions things like international law. How does that fit in?
Right. Even without a world government, states have created rules, international law, through treaties, customs, and international organizations help manage these rules and facilitate cooperation. Think about rules for trade, laws of war like the Geneva Conventions, environmental treaties. They try to bring some order and predictability, even if enforcement can be tricky.
So attempts to manage the anarchy, basically.
You could put it that way, yeah. Building frameworks for interaction.
Well, that's covered a huge amount of ground. From defining political science right through to the global system, all based on Duverger's framework.
It really has. And I think Duverger's strength is providing that solid foundation. His focus on power, the breakdown of the state, the types of regimes and parties, the basics of IR. It gives you a really strong toolkit for starting to understand politics.
Absolutely. A really comprehensive overview.
The launch pad, really.
And that, I think, accomplishes our mission for this deep dive. We wanted to pull out those core insights from Duverger for you, give you that solid grounding. So maybe the takeaway thought is this. As you look at the world, as you read the news, try to apply these concepts. Think about power, who has it, how is it used, is it seen as legitimate, what kind of state are you looking at, what regime type, how do the parties function, how are nations interacting? Seeing these fundamental ideas play out in real time, well, what new questions does that raise for you? Where might you want to dig deeper next?
Yeah, it opens up more questions than it answers sometimes, but that's the point, isn't it?
Exactly. It's a starting point for your own exploration. Until our next deep dive, keep thinking, keep questioning.